Welcome to Engineering Influence, podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies, coming to you from the 2024 Spring Convention and Legislative Summit here in Washington, D.C. And we are wrapping up our general session programming. And to kind of close out our keynote speakers, we are very pleased to be joined by Michael Maslansky with Maslansky Partners. Michael is a specialist when it comes to really the words that work when it comes to talking about a very thorny subject. ESG, which really has become really a Pandora's box of approaches, feelings, thoughts, both in private lives and public sector, private sector, everywhere we look. And Michael did a really good job of trying to demystify this and try to de-weaponize a lot of the terminology. So, Michael, thank you for coming on the program.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
You know, your presentation, I think, was, I always joke, I kind of, maybe it's just the way I kind of present it. It's like communications in a large part is almost the practical applications of common sense. Mm-hmm. But that's trickier than you would imagine because everybody's so busy on getting things done that they don't actually take the time to think about, they don't have the luxury of time to think about the words that they're actually applying to different things. And you know, ESG has been this subject that kind of appeared out of nowhere, kind of accumulated a lot of rapid expansion. And then, to your point, in Florida, you know, when you had the situation with DeSantis and you had this actually break out into the national headlines, and you had this pushback, you know, companies who are trying to navigate this, do business, not alienate customers, but still be responsible and current to modern day trends, they were kind of lost in the shuffle. And, you know, it's a question of how do you deal with this? You know, what encapsulate kind of your view of where ESG is now and whether that even applies to the current environment we're working in.
Yeah, well, so I think, you know, every company has to deal with many different stakeholders, and they can be internal or external. They can be, you might be a public company or a private company, and you have different stakeholders. They could be environmental stakeholders or not. They're certainly clients and governments, and they don't all share the same views and values. And we're living in a world that is deeply polarized, and the way that that plays out in the context of the environmental, social, and governance discussion, or the ESG discussion, is that people have very different interpretations of a lot of the language that's being used. And you know, we say in our business that it's not what you say that matters, it's what your audience hears.
Exactly.
And the reality is that when it comes to ESG, the right and the left are hearing very different things, depending on the language that you use. And so I love your term of de-weaponizing. We are effectively trying to de-weaponize the language of ESG by finding politically neutral language to use to communicate what it is that you're trying to achieve without making it sound political.
Yeah. We have the benefit, at least in our industry, that, and I think it was brought up in the panel discussion, that a lot of the things that we do inherently with the course of business, either it's environmental work or it's public work, private work, engineers generally try to make things better just by, they're brought in to improve something. So they're not setting out to do something, it's kind of just what they do. We're not Bud Light, for example. We're not a brand. You brought up the Dylan Mulvaney example as a perfect example of really, you know, why. Really, the question is why do you think companies are doing? Let's just take it outside of our industry, but let's say Bud Light, Disney. Disney's really having an issue right now. I would say I've been following the whole thing with, you know, what Bob Iger's trying to do, and kind of now he's trying to claw back what he said, that you have these brands that were identified for a specific thing. You kind of understand that with Disney you're getting family entertainment, pretty much innocuous family entertainment. With Bud Light you pretty much have a brand that has been entrenched with a certain idea that you close your mind, like you said, you know what the Bud Light customer is. But they're kind of taking positive steps to try to be overtly maybe political, or they're just using more partisan or technical terms in their branding with these things. Why do you think companies are quick to do that, and do you think that's going to change now that there's been a backlash?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think that there is a significant constituency in America that really supports these actions.
Yeah.
Like, that really is advocating for these actions, that is pushing companies to do it. A lot of companies have employee bases that are really have really strong advocacy for all of these causes around diversity, equity, inclusion, around social justice. And so for a long period of time, these issues were things that you could advocate for and you could get a certain amount of credit for and create a certain amount of brand opportunity for, didn't have a lot of risk because the conservatives, people who disagreed, didn't really speak up.
Yeah.
Then they started to speak up, and all of a sudden something that really was a lot of potential reward and not a lot of risk now was a risk-reward calculus.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing is, I think that there are different kinds of companies approaching it in different ways. You've got companies that are committed to the actions and are not going to back down from the actions. They might still moderate how they talk about these topics to connect them more closely to their business, to better define why it is that they're doing it, to make it sound less political. Yeah. But continue to do what they're doing. And then you have other companies that may decide that this was not core to who they are. That in many cases, those were companies that I would say were doing things that were more performative than substantive. And I think the era of performative ESG is kind of over. So now it's companies that are committed to doing it. And I think actually all companies should be committed to doing a lot of these things. It's just not committed to doing everything or doing it in the way that they were doing it.
And it's more of it's a question of you're not trying to push values, right? You're trying to talk about the value of the work that you're doing in context with the idea of achieving these goals, but not specifically saying, using like the term responsible. Right? Use that instead of right or wrong, because that's not really a charged word, right? It's
absolutely. Look, if I go into a room and I'm talking to somebody who I'm not sure whether they agree with me or I know that they disagree with me, the place that I want to start is common ground. I want to start with language that more people are likely to agree with as an entry point in the conversation. If I start with the most controversial term, it's going to be the end of the conversation. And so a term like responsible business is a term that if you ask people from the right and from the left to describe what it means, they come up with a pretty similar definition, and it's all positive. If you talk about ESG or DEI or social justice, all of a sudden it sounds more ideological than it does, kind of action-oriented, and you may lose half your audience.
And we live in a time where everything is political. And we were talking on the election side with another speaker that when looking at election reform, it is almost there's a parallel, because we've gotten to this point where nobody trusts anything, because everything is now called into question. Everything is now being grabbed by one fringe or the other to use at their advantage, and of course that's having its effect on voting. But from a customer to business standpoint, it's the same thing. You said that in your polling, 80+% of conservatives now feel that it's not just that something's being promoted, but it's being forced down their throats. It's no longer that they can say, well, I don't completely agree with that, but I'm still going to buy the product. They feel like there's something happening where you have this elite group that is trying to change society and force change. At the same time, on the left, you have a large majority who feel that they should be an agent for change. So you have this push-pull. So companies have to navigate that middle ground. And the way that you kind of position is saying, don't use the terminology. Use things that, like to your point, are more inclusive and just kind of neutral, right? Is how to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think we used to live in a world where it was like, if you don't like something, just change the channel. We don't live in that world anymore. Now it's, if you don't like something, you protest it. You try and create a backlash to it to prove the point. It's unfortunate. I wish the world were not that way, but we have to take the world as it is. And the way that I advise companies is, if you don't want to get into a political fight, then you got to be really conscious of the things that could cause it. And so the way that we avoid it is, in the ESG world, there is a lot of highly specialized language.
Yeah.
If you don't understand that language, it feels like it is excluding you from that language. It is elitist, it's exclusive. So I want to use inclusive language, plain spoken terminology. Tell me what it is, so I don't have to guess. When you do that, it's much less polarizing. When you explain why you're doing something and you connect it to your brand or your business, much less polarizing.
Yeah.
When you say, I'm doing these things because they add value to my business, and because I think I have a responsibility to do some of these things, much less polarizing than trying to say, I have a set of values, we have a set of values, everybody agrees with this, and that's why we're doing it.
From I guess from a structural perspective, from the view from the C-suite, and if you have someone who's either a CMO or a chief communications officer, what should they be doing now to think not only with what they say externally and internally to, let's say, media or their internal stakeholders, but social media has become a multiplier because, like you said, you used to be able to turn the channel. Now, luckily with our industry, it's not so much of an effect, but what you see out, the Mulvaney situation became what it was because of the echo chamber on social media, that you had activists on either side really turning this into something bigger, and quite honestly, their corporate response was bad at dealing with that. What should communications officers be thinking about from a social media perspective in how they also communicate these things and kind of navigate the partisan argument that might arise?
Yeah, I think one of the things that continues to surprise me is that companies find themselves in situations that in retrospect are fairly obvious.
Yeah.
Right. Where they don't have kind of the devil's advocate in the room saying, what's the worst thing that you could say about this, and trying to game that out ahead of time. There are some companies that are great at this. They know when they want to be provocative, they plan for it.
Yeah.
They anticipate the backlash, and they know what they're going to do and say in response. For most companies, I think it's a recognition that that there is that you have to be careful with how you communicate. That you have to kind of anticipate what the worst thing is that people can say, and that if you look at the world through that lens, you can start to kind of mitigate the risk.
Yeah.
And then make deliberate choices about where you want to be provocative.
Yeah. It's slow down, take a look at the language, think about it, devil's advocate.
I'll just add one thing, sorry to cut you off, but the really important thing is to recognize that the world does not look at the world. The world does not look at the world the way you look at the world.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that you need somebody who's good at kind of empathizing, getting themselves into the head of people who are different from you.
Yes.
Whether it's politically or in other ways, so that you can think like them.
Yeah, because I was thinking during your presentation, a lot of times you'll say something and you'll come and say, well, there's nothing wrong with it. There's no charge there. And you don't think that you're thinking about it through your lens. Then you have that inherent bias that you're bringing to it. And then you kind of just fall into that trap because there's nobody there to say, well, actually, if you look on the other side, you're going to see an issue. I mean, we luckily, and I think that's a good thing for teams, have a team that's diverse in thought, and don't be afraid to allow the dissenting voice to come into the room, because that's where you can avoid a lot of mistakes and hang-ups.
It is one of the best arguments for diversity, is that if you're going to put anything out into the public, that public is diverse.
Yeah.
And it's harder to think like those different, different people from different backgrounds, different race and ethnicity, if you don't have them represented in your organization.
Yeah, and we use a lot with Lisa and Gail. They did a good job of talking about how a lot of times public and private sector clients are looking at different requirements for their internal internal employees, and what the teams might look like. And I think there's a easy argument from the business side, and as long as we stay focused on the business side of saying, well, if we're doing work in a community that has certain demographic makeup, then doesn't it make sense that the team working on that should also reflect that community? Don't you get the best product if it's? And there are ways to do this where you're not saying, yeah, we're pushing diversity for diversity's sake. We want to make sure that our teams reflect the communities that we serve.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's and there are ways to do this where it's avoiding the politicization and doing it in such a way where you actually have a competitive advantage in the market. But it takes that time to really look at the language.
Yes.
So it's ESG is it's a thorny subject. And the way I figure, I was talking to somebody coming up here about, the question came up in the panel about, should we have a DE&IB committee? And I was talking to this one exec. He says, we just established a committee. I'm like, it always seems like the minute that you think that you have everything figured out, the land shifts underneath your feet, and it underscores the importance of never be also so locked into a concept that you're not willing to change, right?
Yeah, I think the world that we live in is one that is more defined by change than anything else, and so the notion that that we're going to put in something in place and it's not going to need to adapt is it's kind of naive in the world that we're operating in. And so how do you put things in place that have the flexibility to adapt? And I think, there again, when you DEIB is that may have started as a DEI and then you had to add B because somebody, so how do you create that kind of flexibility, that openness where you're trying to bring more people into the conversation? And often it does start with our language. Yeah,
absolutely. Michael, thank you for taking the time with us. I really appreciate your insights, and I think our audience did as well this morning.
Great, Jeff, thanks.
And just so everybody can find you, Michael, Maslansky Partners, you're out of New York City.
Yes.
But you do, of course, nationwide consultancy work. Where can some of our member firms find you online?
Yes, so best place is LinkedIn, Michael Maslansky or Maslansky Partners. We do what we call language strategy, and so any place where you know that it's difficult and important to get the message right, we find the words and approaches to help you do it.
Fantastic. Well, Mike, thank you again.
Thank you.
And again, this has been Engineering Influence, a podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies, and we'll see you next time.